So let's talk about photographing the moon, and then to be more specific, I want to talk about photographing the full moon. Yeah, photographing the crescent moon or other phases can be great and incredible in their own way, but I think we all know photographing the full moon is where it's at. I think it's what we enjoy doing the most, so let's talk about that today. Now, I have to admit that photographing the moon can be, I approach this at least with a little bit of mixed emotions. While I love the images that result, and I love watching the full moon rise, there is a lot of pre-planning that goes into photographing the moon, which results in a little bit of a lack of spontaneity out in the field. So maybe it's more science than it is art. And that sometimes can feel a little bit hamstrung, or I can feel a little bit hamstrung as a result of that. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. In fact, you should do some pre-planning every time you go out into the field. But the moon is going to rise at a specific location at a specific time. And while in other forms of landscape photography, you might have a bit of artistic movement and spontaneity that you can take advantage of out in the field, that moon is going to rise where it's going to rise, when it's going to rise. And so you kind of have to be locked in on that. And so to some degree, that is a little bit too limiting for me at times. That being said, whenever I make a photograph of the full moon, I'm always happy with it at the end. I'm just saying that if you are somebody who likes to be a bit more spontaneous in the field, or you feel like photography is more art than science, then photographing the full moon might not be the most pleasurable thing for you. It might not be the most satisfying thing. Or if you really like pre-planning, maybe this is exactly what you want to do. That being said, I think most photographers are like me in that you like a little bit of both. And that every once in a while, doing some pre-planning and going out and having this really scientific approach to shooting a full moon rising over the horizon can really be satisfying. And so let's talk about that today. In fact, I want to talk about photographing the full moon as it rises over the horizon. And I would do so really focusing on three parts: timing, location, and settings. So let's talk about timing here, right? We're talking about timing so that we are photographing the moon when it is on the horizon. So the best time to do that is either going to be at sunrise or sunset, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. To photograph the moon rising during the day, it won't work because it's just too bright and we can't see the moon. To photograph the moon rising at night, that's really difficult to do with one shot, if not impossible, because the dark sky and the bright moon, there's too much of a contrast there. So while we can expose for the moon and get all the detail, everything else would be super dark. If we were to expose for the foreground and the dark areas, our moon would be totally blown out. It'd just be a big white blob in the sky. So photographing during the day or at night, that moon on the horizon just doesn't work for us. So we need to be shooting the moon when the sun is either setting or when it is rising. And let's talk more specifically about that. So if we want to photograph the moon setting over the horizon, we want to be shooting that when the sun is rising. Conversely, if we want to be shooting the moon rising over the horizon, we want to be shooting when the sun is setting. So we need the sun and the moon to be on opposite horizons. And the reason for this is because we're going to need some of the light from the sun to light up our foreground and light up our moon in a way that the exposure, that the contrast between the two isn't so great. And so we can get all of the detail in the foreground and in the moon itself in one single shot. Now, you can take multiple shots and you can blend those in Photoshop afterwards. But the point of this episode is really to talk about photographing them in one shot and not having to do any blending thereafter. So if you're able to photograph at a time when the sun is setting behind you or rising behind you, and the moon is either rising or setting in front of you, you're going to have enough light so that the foreground is going to be well exposed as well as the moon, and you're going to have perfect timing and perfect lighting to photograph that full moon on the horizon. One of the benefits of living on the East Coast is that I can just go to the Atlantic Ocean and watch the full moon rise over the Atlantic Ocean if I wanted to. And that can be spectacular, especially on a supermoon. But that doesn't necessarily make for a great shot. Like every landscape photo, having some foreground interest in front of the moon can take a great shot of the moon rising and turn it into a spectacular shot of the moon rising. And so as we are planning our shots, we don't want to just be thinking about photographing the moon as it rises and the timing, as I talked about earlier, but we also want to be talking about what is going to be in the foreground of that moon rising and what is going to be what is that moon going to be rising behind as it does come up over the horizon. Now this is where we're going to use an app like PhotoPills or the Photographer's Ephemeris to line ourselves up. With both of those apps, we're able to go in and we're able to find out what time the moon is going to rise and where the moon is going to rise. Now, once we know what time and where, then it's just a matter of lining ourselves up so that whatever our foreground interest is between ourselves and the moon. Now, I try to get myself to be about a mile away from whatever that foreground interest is. And sometimes I can get that far and sometimes I can't. The farther away I can be, the better. And the reason for that is because the farther away I am, and we'll talk about the lens choice in a moment, but the farther away I am, the smaller that subject is going to appear in front of that giant super full moon that's rising behind it. So this is where all of the pre-planning comes. It's just a matter of getting myself in the right place at the right time and having the right foreground interest in place so that when I am taking my shot, all I need to do is get there and go ahead and take it. For example, let's talk about this image of a full moon setting behind this iconic house on the coast of Massachusetts. Now, this house, which looks pretty run down, it is run down, is a very well-known house over on the coast of Massachusetts. And I knew on this day that the moon was going to be setting as the sun was rising behind me, right on the coast, pretty close to where this house was, where this house is. And so all I needed to do was line myself up in a way that allowed the moon to set behind the house as you see here. Now, I was probably about 3/4 of a mile away from the house when I took this shot, and I couldn't get any further because behind me there were sand dunes and then the ocean. So I was pretty much as far away as possible as I could get in this shot. But still, you can see how large the moon looks behind this house and behind the hills that are behind the house as well. So it's just a matter of myself opening up the app, finding out when the moon was going to set, which in this case was right around sunset or sunrise, and then positioning myself in a spot where I could stand and photograph the moon setting right behind this pink house, as it were. So let's talk about settings. And the good news is you've done all the hard work. You have figured out where the moon's going to rise. You figured out when it's going to rise. You've put something of interest between you and the moon. And now all you can do is shoot, and the settings are the easiest part. So let's talk about those for a little bit. As for aperture, well, you can shoot relatively wide open. I've shot everything from 6.3 up to f11, depending on whatever the shutter speed needed to be, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Because what you're probably asking is, well, how does something that's a mile away from me and something that's 225 or 250,000 miles away from me, that's a great distance. Why can I shoot so wide open? Well, it looks like it's a great distance, and it is, but relative to where you are and the lens you're using, it's not. So you've got a pretty wide focal plane at that point. You don't need to worry about everything being in focus. So you can shoot everything from 6.3 to f11. Everything will be in focus because the distance between the object and the moon and you and the object are such that, or the ratio there is such that everything will be in acceptably sharp focus. So you don't need to worry about your aperture a whole lot. What you do need to worry about is your shutter speed. And that may sound funny because we're shooting this giant object that's 250,000 miles away and we're worrying about shutter speed. But we are worrying about shutter speed because as the moon gets closer to the horizon, as it sets or as it rises above the horizon, it moves pretty quickly relative to the horizon line. And so you really want to have a shutter speed that's going to stop that moon from moving and freeze that moon. Otherwise, you're going to get like a white streak blob across your image. I'm thinking 1/30th of a second, 1/20th of a second, or faster. If you start shooting for seconds, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 seconds, you're just going to get a streak of white across your image, and you don't want that. So how do I adjust for that? Well, I'm going to adjust my aperture, again, anywhere from say 6.3 to f11, so that I get a fast enough shutter speed so that I can freeze the moon as it sets or as it rises behind my object. Now the last thing I'm going to need is I'm going to need a long lens. I photograph the full moon rising and setting with my 600 millimeter lens, and sometimes I will add the 1.4 extender on to effectively result in 840 millimeters. And I'm going to, as I said earlier, we're going to get as far away from that subject as we can, hopefully a mile or more away. Now the reason we're doing this, or why the long lens is going to be really effective here, is really a couple of reasons. One, it's going to allow us to photograph that, or zoom in on that foreground interest so that it is not tiny in our picture, but it is going to be tiny relative to the size of the moon that's setting behind it. And so the optics are such that you are photographing that object really up close, relatively up close with your longer lens, but it's still going to look relatively small compared to the large moon behind us, especially if we are the further back we are. Now the other big benefit to shooting with a longer lens is something we talked about in an earlier episode called compression. Well, shooting with a longer lens is going to result in our scene being compressed so that the moon doesn't look like it's 250,000 miles away. It looks like it's right behind whatever your foreground interest is. And that's because of the longer lens that we're using. Now, I will tell you that some people are going to think it's fake as a result, but this gives us an opportunity as photographers to teach folks what compression is and why that happens with our longer lenses. So when we're going to go out and shoot, we've done all of the hard work. We've figured out where we're going to be, when we're going to be there. We found out a location that's going to include some interesting foreground interest. And we're going to be shooting it relatively wide open on our aperture at a shutter speed that's fast enough to freeze the moon and with a longer lens. Well, I do hope that this helps if you're interested in photographing full moons as they rise or set over the horizon. The good news is if you're watching this episode at relatively the time that it was published, there's a full moon coming. November 15th on the East Coast, where I am up here in the Northeast, the moon is going to be rising at about 4:30 in the afternoon, which will be 10 minutes after sunset. So really the lighting should be optimal for us to be able to create incredible images of that full moon rising just after sunset. Now, and I'm going to be going to my local lighthouse that's pretty local, and I'm going to be setting that up so that that lighthouse is about almost 2 miles away in order to photograph the moon rising behind it. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm just keeping my fingers crossed that we get clear skies, because obviously if there are clouds, it's really hard to photograph the moon if there are clouds out. So we're going to keep our fingers crossed for clear skies and for that full moon to rise exactly where we're hoping it's going to rise. Now, I will say this also, and that is that it doesn't matter whether I'm photographing the full moon rise in November or the next full moon that's going to work out in the calendar for this. All of these tips and tricks really work throughout the year. So if you're thinking about getting interested in photographing the full moon as it rises or falls over a horizon, just keep in mind, get your timing right, get your location set, and have your settings ready to go. And I think you're going to make some great and very compelling images as a result. I am sure that there are other things that folks have, other tips and tricks that folks have that I may have missed. I'd love for you to put those in the comments below. Share them with the community so we can all learn from what you have to share. I'll comment as they come in as well. I really appreciate that. And if you don't mind, giving me a like and a share and a follow or a subscribe would go a long way to helping me out as well. So that's what I have for you today. I hope this was helpful. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.